Good morning, everyone. Suddenly feeling a little bit out of date with my sort of pen and paper composition after that little extravaganza. But yes, so as Theo mentioned, what I'm speaking about today is really a whistle-stop tour of my master's dissertation. Now, especially during the last sort of tail end of my undergraduate years and then during my master's studies, I found myself leaning towards still retaining that desire to express narrative and therefore sort of that movement from onset, climax to closure in my music, but really exploring and moving away from sort of more commonly understood tonal materials, not necessarily as a way of rejecting them, but as a way of understanding what is happening in that space by depriving myself of that tool set. Which really led me to this investigation of how do I still maintain that understandability, that narrative structuring, without a commonly or a shared sign and syntactic system. So I really found that it's necessary in this discussion to begin with a firm understanding, or at least a definition in situ of what closure is. Starting with the differentiation between ending and closure. The term ending I found was frequently understood as being simply the terminal point of a musical period or process, whereas closure really leans into a more qualitative element of that ending, describing that ending as not just being terminal, but as being a logical or comprehensive completion of that process or procedure. This association between closure and sort of process completion does harken back to the Gestalt School of Psychology and their discussions of closure principle, which of course has been applied in various ways to several sort of adjacent meaning fields. But the common threads that you can sort of pull from those various discussions is this observed preference in human cognition for the perception of completed continuous wholes in their sort of lowest energy or simplest state. Now, this line of thinking was developed in understanding the perception of simultaneously presented visual wholes. So translating that understanding into musical listening requires a bit of extra work. And so I found myself leaning more towards a body of theory that does actually deal with the human cognition of temporal spans, which sort of falls under the umbrella term of event segmentation theory. Now, event segmentation theory is concerned with the human cognition of goal-oriented temporal spans as separate or segmented natural objects, much in the way that our visual perception segments the visual world into discrete elements. Our hearing or our visual perception of a sequence of events can also create understood brackets. Consider the process of buttoning up a shirt. You begin the process buttoning up the shirt and you end the process with the last button, and therefore that time span is understandably complete. Now, event segmentation theory, much like Gestalt psychology, was developed in the realm of visual cognition, which is sensitive really to, sorry, I think I've skipped a step here. I do want to quickly dial back. So EST is concerned with the cognition of goal-oriented temporal spans as discrete wholes, and it proposes thus that a temporal span will be perceived as complete when a known or predicted goal has been seen to be achieved. And this really outlines the two major requirements of this bracketing of temporal spans. The goal must be perceived to have arrived, and it also must have been predicted. So we can't just have an arbitrary arrival. That would not be satisfactory. This perception of goal achievement in the visual space is really sensitive to two major subheadings, and that is the arrival of a predicted configuration, of a predicted production element, etc., and that object arriving in a predicted location. So going back to my analogy of buttoning up my cardigan, If I were to begin buttoning it up and stop halfway, there would be a brief moment of, okay, is this done now? Fine. Okay, I've discontinued the action, but if I were to complete all the way to the final button, it would be more predicted that that would be the ending. Thus the configurational prediction. Similarly, the temporal prediction, if I were to begin buttoning up the cardigan in this room here, but was only seen to be finishing buttoning it up, say, 3 doors down, that process might be separated out into 2 separate understandings unless some intervening material was sort of provided to fill in the gaps. Now, translating this again out of the visual space into the auditory space, we have to make some adjustments. Keeping in mind I'm a concert music composer, so there are some assumptions that go along with that. And that is that spatial location is often a less attended to parameter. There's a basic assumption that if I sit down to perform, say, a concert work by Debussy, Ravel, etc., I will probably begin and finish the performance in the same location. But in music, we are far more sensitive to spatial location. Consider our attendance to relative duration in musical listening, our sensitivity to under-tempo performances, etc. So our durational sense is far more robust here. With this in mind, we can now really go back to developing that definition of musical closure, combining our understandings from the Gestalt school and event segmentation theory to arrive at the following summary. Musical closure is the quality of an ending which is perceived to have satisfied our configurational and temporal predictions concerning the ending of a musical event or process. This sort of implication realization model is well enough discussed in the writings of Leonard B. Meyer, etc. But the distinction I found valuable here, which I borrowed from outside of the musicological literature, is the separation into both the location and the configuration, which is taken from Barbara Herrnstein-Smith's book, Poetic Closure. So, the initial step then is to establish how to form configurational predictions. Being able to predict subsequent elements in a musical process requires there to be some sort of ordering element. That is not to say all parameters need to be ordered. Music is typically a combination of ordered versus unordered parameters. You'll see this being discussed, I think, as primary versus secondary parameters, or process versus noise, etc., depending on the reading. Of course, this can then, I think, be broken down into 2 basic types of ordering processes, being grammatical and linear. Of course, I'm probably the most familiar with the grammatical process, that is tonal syntax, in which subsequent elements can be, well, so a given element implies a series or a selection of possible subsequent elements, with our bias being developed towards one of those continuations depending on context, hierarchical factors, etc. Now, the application of artificial grammars in non-tonal spaces is quite possible, but I think it is perhaps more complex, and I haven't quite been able to establish my thinking on how this is best approached. For now, I admit I consider artificial grammars to be somewhat impractical to the concert space. Most studies of the cognition of artificial grammars haven't quite been able to nail down the necessity or effect of priming periods. And so, do we really want to expect our listeners to have gone and done homework listening before a given concert, or perhaps to have sat through several works that maybe didn't make sense before then arriving? Okay, now concert work number 5 makes sense, but by then everybody's torn up the chairs and left the venue. This really, for me, in a practical sense, leaves simple linear processes, processes that are governed by some sort of constant modifier. And this is, again, borrowing from Smith's discussion, where generative principles are based on the concept of repetition. Three basic subsets, I think, can be put forward, and that is the use of a repeated figure. In music, of course, we have ostinati, isorhythm, things of that nature. But for the minds, I consider the logical coherence of a sequence of squares. It's the same shape again and again and again. There's a certain binding element to that. They are recognizable as a sequence. Following that, you could have a modification of an element by a fixed value. So either, say, take a triangle and add a side each time to generate the subsequent element, triangle, square, pentagon, hexagon, heptagon. Or you could double the number of sides, triangle, hexagon, and I can't remember the Latin for 12. There we go, dodecahedron. And lastly, we can, of course, play around with anti-structural principles. This is a term, I'm not sure if it was coined by Uckleford and Sargent, but they certainly used it in the discussion of serial procedures, where it is not necessarily the tone row of the serial composition that is perceived by the listeners in their participant group, but it's the constant rule of non-repetition that was really engaged with most actively. And so, again, we have some sort of constant principle at play. Now that we've set our procedure in motion now, and we have the ability to predict subsequent elements, we have to develop some way of bringing sort of the train ride to a halt in a way that doesn't seem arbitrary. So what I mean by arbitrary, if we consider the following two statements. I went to it was raining outside. Hopefully it was understandable that both of those were two separate statements. But the first statement was only really understood as having ended sort of by brute force, by having begun a new statement. Whereas the second statement really satisfied our requirements for a complete sentence. Hopefully there was that qualitative distinction between the two. So how do we take some linear process now and bring it to a close in a way that doesn't just sort of cut it short? In a review of sort of ending-orientated features in the music of the 20th century, there are a number of proposals of how to do this. But I think some of them are best understood as being rhetorical and not really closural on the fact that they either don't satisfy a requirement of the temporal or the configurational prediction. Most commonly it's the temporal element which is left out. Elements of this would be the manipulation of tension arcs, if you look at the work of Chris Bryden, or the fairly developed review of abatement by Charles Tebbs. Essentially, this is the look at how a musical process tends to begin, reach a climax, drop a little bit in intensity, minor secondary climax before decreasing in intensity towards its end. The reason why I schedule these under more rhetorical is, again, we don't really have a way of determining when that abatement is going to stop, outside of really the mechanical limits of human listening. There's also a lot of discussion around highlighting effects. These could be accentuated elements such as registral extremes suddenly appearing close to endings. I think Elton Ashworth discusses this in the music of Schoenberg. We also might see the fairly typical gesture of a crescendo at the end of a work, counterbalancing the effect of the slowed harmonic rhythm and ritardando. The third type that I really observed as being its own distinct thing is the use of motif at endings. Claire Eng makes quite a good review of this. And two of the most prominent being the use of ending motifs and framing motifs. Ending motifs being the use of a consistent motif at all endings within a given work or given section of work, or framing motifs, which describe the use of the same motif to begin and end a musical period. Again, neither of these really are predictable in and of themselves as to when they will arrive. They rely on some other sort of backup process to give the cue of them being achieved. And really the reason why I moved these rhetorical features off to one side is the study of event segmentation theory, and particularly its application to music in the work of Crystal Peebles, establishes that particularly goal arrival, which is internal to the process, is preferred by a listener when establishing the end of a process, even to the point of discarding severe parametric discontinuities or accentuating factors. So, with this in mind, we are in fact going to have to look towards ending-orientated techniques that are internal to the process that we are working with. Again, I found roughly 3 broad categories that one can work with. Terminal modification, borrowed again from Barbara Hearn Sneed-Smith. You might have noticed I quite enjoyed that book at this point. The inclusion of bounding gestures or bounding elements, and processes which are inherently self-limiting. Terminal modification describes the altering of an ordered parameter within the final or penultimate element of a process. I believe Smith shows this using the Elizabethan sonnet as an example, which is generated according to 2 basic rules: the 10-syllable line with alternating stress patterns, and the alternating rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. But then arriving at the end of the poem, we retain rule number 1, the 10-syllable line, but we shift to our first repeated rhyme scheme, G, G, breaking that pattern of alternation. In music, Charles Tebbs remarks on a similar process in the form of the aposiopesis, which is essentially the interruption of a process or the delaying of the arrival of its final element as a way of accentuating that point, developing increased expectation, and thus the resolution of its arrival, bringing the process to a close. Second category I mentioned, bounding gestures. I used to refer to things in the vein of gap-fill structures, such as, I believe in Explaining Music, Mayer talks at length about gap-fill melodies, which is a melody begun with an initial leap or extreme displacement, and then completed by the progressive or logical return to the point from which the leap was initiated. I think it's not too much of a stretch to say we can, in any parameter where we have good relative judgment, that same process could be repeated. Similarly, palindromes have been frequently used in the music of the 20th century, and I think these essentially follow the same rules of moving to an outer limit and returning to a point of origin, except, of course, the motion to the outer limit is the mirror of the return. Now, to me, both of these I use with somewhat more caution than the terminal modification, as they rely on the return to a point of origin for their potency, for their efficacy. So they become very sensitive to the limits of working memory. If the end of the process is too far displaced from its origin, then there's the chance that it might lose how understandable it is. And lastly, I would like to bring up self-limiting processes, which I think are the most interesting. On a part of they really play on a lot of inherent musical properties. First of all, I noticed there was much use of the logical return to initial elements or equivalent of initial elements. in much the same territory as the gap fill or the palindrome. However, in music we have elements which are understandable as being equivalent, such as our octave equivalents in the realm of pitch. And so we can move towards a pitch which is not actually our starting point, but which is understandable as the equivalent of our starting point. So requiring far less motion than, say, completing a full palindrome. There is also the arrival at an element which has previously, entirely or in part, been accented agogically, metrically, registered dynamically, or otherwise. There's been a lot of study in the way in which the accentuation of certain elements throughout a musical process allows for those elements to be perceived as more stable if they are reiterated as the process's terminal element. So through the accentuation of various elements throughout the process, we can create that level of expectancy that this might be an acceptable ending point, and therefore sort of logically track our motion through the process towards that final point. Lastly, I would like to discuss processes with a vanishing point. These are processes that mechanically have some sort of limit within the realm of music, not necessarily imposed by our auditory faculty. Processes such as registral contraction to a unison, for instance, once they hit the unison, they can't go any further. Registral expansion, the inverse, could just keep going on and on and on, but if you bring it into a 0 point, then it must actually end at that point. Textural unification, very similar to this. The motion from polyphony or homophony into monophony, for instance, has a certain level of limit. And lastly, one can also discuss techniques such as liquidation, again in the music of Schoenberg, whereby motivic elements are gradually peeled away, leaving only the absolute structural necessity for that point, which again does have a hard limit imposed upon it. So, to rather rapidly sum up that, musical closure, at least in my understanding of it, is the quality of arriving at an ending whose configuration and temporal location are predictable. In non-tonal context, I believe this is most effectively achieved through the use of linear processes in order to structure the period's primary parameters. That process may then arrive at a preemptible ending point by being self-limiting, expressed within a bounding structure, or being brought to a close using tonal modification. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Audience, questions, please? Brilliant. Have you thought a little bit about... have you thought a little bit about closures that happen outside of the same event as endings? So I'm thinking a little bit about sort of psychological trauma, for instance, where you've experienced a very violent event, some kind of ending or laceration of some sort, and then only years after does the closure, through paying a psychologist a lot of money, actually come. And why I think of this is often, I think in experimental music, the negation of closure at the end of a piece is quite a cool thing to play with, right? But it's in processing that ending only after the event that we recognize some kind of closure, and it's more closure on the dislocation of ending that happens outside of its own temporality. It's a very complicated way of saying it's a closure that happens not when the ending happens.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how that fits into your model. Or can your model compensate for that or account for that or not? And it's okay if it can't.
No,
we can find closure later.
I must admit, I think that doesn't fit too well into how I'd begun to consider it, but it's well worth expanding the thought into that space as well. Thank you. Yeah, worth a read afterwards, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you very much for your presentation. I guess I'm curious, besides your title, which basically describes the realm you're talking about as non-tonal context, I'm curious about the aesthetics of your music. You said it's also concert music, and what sort of, I guess, what your music sounds like, I suppose. And then sort of linked to that is my question about the literature, about this psychological literature, and also the Barbara person. Is that all staying within the realm of the listeners to concert music demographic? Because I'm curious about grammars and archetypes of structure, and whether you've kind of situated that in this realm, like explicitly.
Okay. There are a few points to that. So starting off with the comment on the literature, because that's foremost in my head there. So most of the psychological literature, event segmentation theory is fairly domain general. It's not focused on concert music specifically. I think, yes, I mentioned it was originally intended for the use in visual cognition, but a lot of the material translates, I think, fairly well. So I did have to do a little bit of adjustment. Barbara Hensing Smith's work is largely in the realm of poetry. In fact, the book that I quoted is in the reading of poetry, but it is aimed at that relationship between perceiver and creative work. So again, a bit of wrangling, not perfectly adapted to my field. And lastly, yes, Gestalt psychology not being specifically music. So yes, certainly adapting and borrowing and tying a lot of thought together to develop my argument there. So could you go back to this? Oh, the aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's not, sorry, yes. It changes a lot. And each composition tends to begin with that questioning process of how do I want to work with this? Do I want to create a narrative arc? But I think the composition that really was underway for the majority of this is a percussion ensemble work, which should be premiered in October, hopefully. But that played around a lot with using musical vanishing points as its sort of structural markers. For instance, using the scalar materials were based around a verticalized palindrome over C sharp, and then the music from both upper and lower voices proceed towards that central note point, vanishing onto a pitch center. I'm trying to think. Oh, that also did play around. I was attempting to make use of more space and sort of the 3D image of the ensemble there, so that most musical gestures begin in the instruments on the wings and proceed and end in the center of the ensemble, playing around with ideas like that. I have yet to see how well that has played out, but hopefully the performance will give some feedback on that.
Cool, thank you so much. I guess my first question, I would love to see the composition. Where is it being performed?
It should be here in C7,
Okay.
I believe 17th of October, 1 o'clock.
Okay.
I'll check my calendar and let you know.
Cool, thank you. The first question was sort of coming, or the second question was coming from this curiosity about the cultured perception of time, right? And how that is specific. And there's also the kind of the way modernity has sort of shaped a globalized Euro hegemony of perception of time as well, and whether that's something whether that comes in any way in your thinking or in your thesis. You don't have to respond now because maybe someone else has a question, but that's the realm that I'm working in, so I was just...
Okay. Now, I must admit, I allowed myself to remain within the sort of the assumptions of the Western concert music space for that. But it's, again, and also very much worth considering, so, because I don't think I'm going to finish this topic for a long time now. So every little suggestion of things I can add to it is very, very much appreciated.
Hi there, thank you, Jeremy. My question kind of feeds of hers. It was the idea of, or rather the concept of infinity, you know, having no end. How do we think about this concept? The idea came in my head, I think it's a John Cage piece, it's an organ work, if I'm not mistaken, that's being played, one note every couple of years or something like that. So, you know, having to experience that and leaving, you know, going on forever, you know, no real end, not getting that satisfaction. How do you think about that? The idea of infinity in music, prolonged. Yeah,
it's interesting. So, I tend to engage with that as being completely its own and equally valid aesthetic experience. So I didn't approach closure as being a inherently valuable thing. It's something that I enjoy in my writing, and so I was trying to develop my thinking on how to achieve that. But certainly, the lack of closure is very much its own completely valid compositional approach, yeah.
Thank you.
At a loss for words because there are so many aspects of your work. I hope that one can explore these many facets in a further study in your doctoral work, for example. And you said in October there was a performance of one of your compositions.
Yes.
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to our audience as well.